Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming. Strategically, when I'm a participant in the room, I always come 5 minutes late because you don't want to listen to the moderator tell his or her story. So people will be coming in the next few minutes. But we're really glad that you've come to join us in the last session of the thematic track on private sector and partnership financing. I'm Samuel Tumiwa. I work with the Asian Development Bank. I'm the ADB representative in Washington, D.C. for North America, so covering the U.S. and Canada. And we have a very distinguished panel, and I just wanted to start by saying that we're going to change the format a little bit. If you had seen it online, it was going to be the first 3 speakers, and then we were going to have a panel discussion. But I think we will lose some of what others will have to say in that panel discussion. So we're going to give everybody an opportunity to speak, and then we'll have a discussion with you, and we'll create a bit more time to have some question and answer and discussion with the floor at the end. So we'll have 7 speakers. So, this is probably one of the larger panels in this week because yeah, so it's going to be my job to manage this wild panel. I think talking about policy and regulatory issues is actually the most important conversation. It's actually the most important part of ADB's work. We're a bank, we're the Asian Development Bank, and a lot of discussion and talk is about the financing bit, right? How do we get financing I think that's important. But for ADB, I think financing is the 3rd thing we do. I think the most important thing we do in ADB is the policy discussion and dialogue that we have. If in the energy sector you're lending to the national utility, but the national utility is not operating efficiently, we're just putting the country into more debt, the utility into more debt, and they will continue to lose money as a utility unless we fix them and how they operate. And that requires policy discussion and regulatory discussion. ADB is in a good place because we participate in that policy and regulatory discussion. The second most important job we do is capacity building. Once you do the policy regulatory work, then we need to do the capacity building to get them to where they need to be on that. And then the financing comes in. But it's a virtuous circle because the financing buys us a seat at the table to have that regulatory dialogue. You know, you're lending $500 million, you're lending $1 billion. You can have a serious dialogue with the government. I used to be the country director in Afghanistan, and we were the biggest financier of infrastructure in the government. So you get to see the president and the finance minister and get into serious arguments with them about how we structure the power sector or the road sector. So I think this discussion on policy and regulatory was actually a very, very important discussion. And we look forward to talking to the presentations and see how it works. So I'll stop there so we can save time for the discussions afterwards. I'm going to ask our first speaker to come up, and we're not going to do introductions. Everything's available on the website, and so have her come up and talk about the topic. Thank you.
Right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 3rd, 4th day of ASEF. Today, obviously, I've got 7 minutes, so I will be quick, but we're going to do a very quick canter through really sort of what are the key regulatory challenges and, look at some solutions and how it has or hasn't worked in the region of sort of really common legal sort of barriers to investment in clean energy in the region. My name is Fiona. I am head of Asia Pacific at Trinity International, and we are an emerging markets boutique law firm. So we very commonly end up looking at, legal regimes to help people like ADB and some of the panel, determine whether or not, they can really economically be able to bank and manage projects. So really, the biggest barriers to investment are really often legal and regulatory. Governments really need to be encouraged to create enabling environments for the creation really of public-private partnership. And I say that with the emphasis on partnership because I think one of the key takeaways of sort of trying to develop clean energy is to encourage private sector investment and development. And to do this, governments need to ensure that they have created both frameworks that allow people to understand what needs to be done, but also that they make it as easy as it can be to implement in practice. So I've sort of put a very quick slide up here. What are the key challenges? Well, for a lot of the projects that we see, a lot of big issues often are around regulatory uncertainty. I think when we're talking about clean energy, a lot of that can be regulatory uncertainty caused by, for example, you've got new technology and actually what you've got in the existing regulations doesn't really account perhaps for certain specificities of that. I think grid codes are a really good example. When you're looking at trying to do clean energy, particularly small decentralized projects, if your project is quite a small size project, it's not uncommon to then discover that actually your electricity law and your regulations don't really provide for projects that fall within a certain size. Often, permitting processes can be extremely complex. Even the ENS requirements, you need an ESIA, then you may need further, ESMPs. And actually, if you're looking at smaller clean projects, that can be incredibly onerous. And also, if you're going to be able to structure and financially design your project, then you need to be able to identify exactly what you are going to have to do. Foreign investment restrictions versus incentives. Clearly, one of the key regulatory issues can often be that it can be incredibly difficult for your foreign developers to be able to manage a project. It can be very basic things on an economic level, such as repatriation of funds, opening bank accounts, and then the reality will be that if you are doing international investment, you will need to ensure that funds can be paid out to lenders as well as to equity. And all of that needs to be able to be accomplished easily without high withholding taxes. So often governments can help themselves by making it easier for foreign companies to own accounts, to be able to exchange money, perhaps giving support where there may be liquidity issues, and also ensuring that they perhaps provide certain incentives such as tax holidays and customs duty breaks, for example. And then the fourth one that I did put up, it's not necessarily a sort of legal regulation issue, but it is an issue in terms of from a legal contractual perspective, is often the lack of standardized contractual risk allocation. You can look at many countries currently trying to build up their IPP markets in the region. If you go to Sri Lanka, for example, you will find perhaps that you may have 3 different projects that all have very different or not necessarily very aligned commercial terms or risk allocation. And all of that doesn't really help to encourage investor confidence. So, noting I'm really running out of time and I'm on slide 2, I think, what are the things that you need to think about? Well, really, are there competing laws and regulations? We find in some jurisdictions, are you looking at the PPA law? Are you looking at the investment law? Uzbekistan is a great example. They're doing projects under 2 regimes. It is often not clear to developers which regime they want to adopt and which can be better. You look at other countries that are developing their PPP laws, and sometimes they are inconsistent actually with the electricity law. And again, it is not clear then which agencies or which regulator is actually responsible for the project, which then sort of it provides even greater difficulty when you're looking at who is actually issuing licenses. Who do I need to go to? Often things are at a national level. They can also be at a regional level. And all of this creates both complexity and also just another layer of sort of added delays, particularly where government agencies themselves may not actually have capacity. And I think it's not just in licensing, but just generally with PPA negotiation and document negotiation. Governments don't always have capacity to be able to manage all of this. So trying to sort of build a PPP team that can perhaps manage this efficiently is one way of helping to encourage the sector. Also, are there transparent procurement regulations? You can look at many countries in the region. We're working with ADB at the moment to help create, clearer PPP laws to create transparency in tender processes. Often, it is very unclear how projects are sometimes being bilaterally negotiated. So, again, it helps with investor confidence if people can really understand what process people should be following to create a properly tendered project. And often that needs to happen at government level. Because, for example, you will have government parties who may have regulation but are not really policing the implementation. And then the other things, just very quickly before I'm cut off, are there clear frameworks for new technologies, which I touched on earlier? I think there are lots of ways in which governments can really encourage investments by creating sort of fiscal incentives through, as I mentioned earlier, tax holidays and various tax incentives, but also encouraging green programs. And I think one of the great things, for example, ADB is doing projects in the Maldives is encouraging funds like ACLIF, the climate funds, which are creating sort of subsidy arrangements and giving incentives to developers to do small scale but nonetheless essential clean energy projects in the region. Thank you. And I will. Sorry, you'll see there are lots more slides, but you can fit those.
Thank you. And it's difficult because there was a lot of content there. There was a lot of depth there. Just a quick question, and you've done this in many countries, and in the scale of the most difficult countries and the easiest countries in our region, what is your experience?
Joe, I think the hardest country I've worked in the region, I would probably say Kazakhstan, and trying to do small scale projects in Papua New Guinea where the legislative regime just isn't there yet. Yeah.
And the easiest?
Do you know what? We're actually doing a project in Cambodia, and to be honest, aside from land issues, it's been fairly straightforward.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it doesn't make size isn't a matter, level of development doesn't matter.
No, and I think sometimes people forget that even if your project is very small and the value is quite small, that doesn't mean that it's going to take any less effort and resources than a project of 1 megawatt could take the same resources actually as a project that's
right.
300
That's right.
megawatts.
Thank you, Fiona. And she's going to upload her presentation if you want to see the other slides that are on there.
Thank you.
Okay, next, Namita, please.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to focus as an ex-banker from a practitioner's lens on how banks and financial regulators can accelerate Asia's energy transition. And this is through repurposing and embedding transition-sensitive approaches into the existing levers of liquidity operations, capital requirements, and supervisory guidance. So, okay. Very quickly, not talking much about this, but the global demand that has surged, Asia accounts for almost 50% of the electricity demand. And the target that ASEAN countries have taken of 23%, that requires an annual investment of about 180 billion. Despite this momentum, Asia continues to grapple with the balance between financing clean energy, high dependence on fossil fuels, and a constrained fiscal space. If you look at some of the developments, these really helped mobilize capital. There are just transition related aspects that have been brought into transition now, and national level policies that have come up in terms of taxonomies across geographies, realizing the fact that there is an estimation of about 9 to 10 trillion US dollars that are required for energy transition. We've seen how some of the central banks have demonstrated a very targeted approach through several tools, and these are particularly monetary and credit policy tools that address the high capital costs, underdeveloped green lending channels, and the limited fiscal space for public subsidies. Then the prudential and supervisory tools that look at the core transition finance gaps, and market implementation tools like addressing the shallowness of the green asset markets and weak incentives for financial institutions. If you deep dive into the first aspect of monetary and credit policy, I wanted to highlight what's available and what are the challenges. So, green refinancing, a very targeted monetary policy measure that provides preferential funding to commercial banks for eligible green loans, allowing kind of recycling of capital so that you can offload the qualifying green loans to the central bank and in turn relieve or free up a bank's balance sheet, thus encouraging more green lending. I think Bangladesh Central Bank is a good example here where they've unlocked about $200 million in green loans, scaling up their entire rural solar irrigation program. Then there are direct lending quotas like which significantly boost the credit availability, and these are like priority sector lendings. And if you look at a case in point in India, the introduction of renewable energy into India's PSL witnessed a year-on-year growth of 9.8% in renewable additions and an installed RE capacity that increased by 128%. There are challenges. While these tools are there, limited bankability, no pipeline, especially in smaller and diversified economies, many monetary authorities are cautious of deploying non-traditional tools, viewing climate action outside of the core inflation or financial stability measures. And of course, there are no human capacities essentially to deal with the complexity of assessing, monitoring, and managing green assets. When you look at prudential and supervisory tools, essentially climate scenario analysis and stress testing, these are being asked for. Climate scenario analysis more from a forward-looking risk assessment of how financial institutions are performing under different climate and policy pathways, or stress testing to evaluate the performance under extreme but possible adverse conditions. And these are making financial institutions think about what's sitting in their portfolios. Risk weights and minimum capital requirements being recalibrated to account for climate risk, and also it works towards making financial institutions not hold high emission or climate vulnerable assets, so making it expensive for financial institutions. But I think this also lacks the challenges are weak risk modeling because climate data is not available. Physical risk data is a big problem. Technical expertise not there, and high potential of stranded assets, sectoral instability, and job losses if, say, suddenly a central bank brings in certain norms to tighten capital to high emission sectors. So, and with the over dependency of certain economies on coal, that becomes a bit of a difficulty. Next, moving on market implementation tools that many central banks have brought out. I think one of the interesting ones that I want to point out here is the green quantitative easing, which is, for example, used by some central banks to purchase green or green social sustainability linked bonds as a part of the broader asset purchase program. And this really increases the demand, lowers the cost of capital for issuers, and sends a very strong signal. Then there are green collateral frameworks, eligibility screening, where central banks put in conditions for the access to funding. Here again, the lack of eligible green assets lead to limited use of quantitative easing or collateral frameworks, narrow mandates, unclear policies. So all this works against banks. So what is it that needs to be done? And I putting out a recommendation paper to the ASEAN central banks. I think a 3-pillar framework is very, very essential. The first is on aligning monetary and prudential policies with the transition objectives of the country to essentially shape incentives, recalibrate risk, and mobilize green capital. This requires a glide path of differential capital requirements, adjusting capital buffers for green and brown exposures, and that would then result in integrating transition risk into the prudential framework. And Bank of France has explored this green supporting, penalizing brown kind of capital frameworks, but has cautioned on over-reliance. Green assets, because they carry significant short-term risks and excessive incentives, may really hurt or distort markets. So that's something that needs to be looked at. A green asset tagging system is very, very important, and creating green refinancing windows offering cheaper liquidity for climate green aligned collateral, mimicking targeted long-term refinancing operations. All this can fuel capital. The second pillar is on supporting market development and risking green investments by making investments like green bonds, say for example, eligible as collateral or outright purchases during asset purchase programs that are done by central banks. And this will boost the demand, the liquidity, facilitate a robust green bond market. ECB, in fact, the European Central Bank is doing this and also offering differentiated haircuts against it. I think DFIs play a very important role to support financial institutions. Carbon pricing, very critical in many markets, is being worked out. However, the carbon pricing mechanisms are required to, one, send the right economic signals, drive emission reduction, and ensure that monetary incentives reflect true cost and the dynamics of a low carbon transition future. I'll just take just a minute. I think institutional capacity is extremely important. We work across financial institutions, and what we find is we are dealing with risk credit officers, relationship managers who do not understand climate, which is a very complex subject, renewable energy. They are just looking at targets. So how do central banks start their own trainings? So, the Department of Regulation needs to get trained into how to look at climate related supervisory policies, disclosure frameworks, and macroeconomic modeling. Regulatory sandboxes have come up in many markets. I think that's very essential, but they need to really look at the development, the digitalization, and the implementation of projects like this. I think with that, just a last point, central banks, we are suggesting to move from exploration to implementation, and a 3-pillar framework would essentially provide that kind of transition that we are looking for. Thank you very much. There are slides here with case studies to substantiate what has been put out, and I would upload this presentation and encourage everybody to take a look at it. Thank you.
Thank you. Hang on there. Thank you, Namita. I think this is a very important and interesting presentation because it's not often you get to look behind the screen, and this is 2 steps behind the screen. We often talk about project financing, we talk about PPPs, we talk about structuring the deals and how to make things happen. And then this is the people that provide the incentives to the financial institutions to do clean energy. So I think that's very insightful. If we look at your 3 recommendations that you have, should they be sequential? The one is more important than the other, or we do all 3 at the same time?
I think we need to do all at the same time. However, it needs to be on a glide path because we don't want sudden shocks to the system. So, for example, climate-related financial disclosures are being introduced by many countries, many regulators, and these are starting with disclosures as the first starting point, and then looking at how do you implement it as a part of your portfolio and assessment.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, we'll go to our next speaker, please. The next presentation is actually quite interesting. They're tag teaming. There's 2 people talking. They only still get 7 minutes each. And please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. While we wait for the slides to be loaded, there we go. Just by way of introduction, I'll let Josh introduce himself in just a moment. My name is Mohammed Badisi. I have the pleasure, I'm a lawyer by training, a project finance attorney. I work as a law professor researching in contract design, but I come to you today wearing my hat as the co-director at the Energy for Growth Hub, a think tank based in the US for our power contracts transparency program. And one of the reasons I'm excited to have this conversation today is my real passion, and one of the focuses of my career has been on open information and open information sharing. And it's hard to imagine a more dynamic market with more information to share than the one we find ourselves with here in the Asia Pacific region. So just very quickly, the point that we want to share today and sort of the general gist of this presentation is both obvious but critical at the same time, that we've reached a point in the development of power markets, especially in the development of so-called private power markets, where transparency and access to information has become critically important. It's probably one of the most lacking elements of a well-developed framework that we see in the market today. Traditionally, transparency has been a sort of code for anti-corruption, for concerns around, money laundering, and, beneficial ownership, things of that sort. But we're now reaching a point as a fundamental cost level. Research shows that increasingly soft costs in project development, in power project development, account for 30 to 40% of project costs these days. Those are the time you're paying lawyers, the time you're paying the financial advisors, the time you're paying all those non-building, non-hardware related folks. And I say this with great respect to Fiona and her team, who's helped me tremendously in this space. And as a lawyer myself, Cost effective, yes, but cost real at the same time. And I think I say this with respect, but also with acknowledging if our job is to continue bringing down the cost of power, if our job is to continue building cost efficient and affordable energy projects, the next space for innovation, the next space for gains in efficiency isn't in the production of solar panels, isn't in the software optimization of transmission networks. It's in the optimization of the contracting process and the sharing of information around that process. We've seen very real benefits in contracts and in markets that have adopted open contracting regimes. We worked with the state of Hawaii in the US, which took a 2-year-long negotiation process for hybrid solar plus battery projects and cut it down to 6 months through the standardization of templates. We worked in small markets like the Bahamas, where their regulator slash procuring agency is 1.5 people, and they were able to negotiate 28 PPAs in the last 12 months because of the adoption of a standardized template framework, which significantly reduced both the complexity and frankly the overhead costs in managing that process. And even on the corporate space, Google just in the last year, we've been observing their adoption of a software-based PPA negotiation platform where they're now negotiating corporate PPAs for the purchasing of mostly solar, some wind power in 2 weeks. It's literally a point-and-click process between them and the IPPs. So we know that the possibility of real meaningful gains, real cost savings is possible through the adoption both of greater information sharing policies, putting precedents out in the marketplace, putting templates out in the marketplace, but also through information sharing amongst regulators, amongst key decision makers to understand what's going on. I think Fiona made an excellent point early on when she mentioned that just because a project is smaller doesn't make it any easier. And as our chair mentioned, one of the things we want is to have a seat at the table. Governments want to have a seat at the table too, but they want to see the menu ahead of time. They want to understand what it is that they're shopping for. And the inability to have an insight, a fundamental insight into what the market structure is for a PPA today. What the typical, you see the price for a contract. Oh, we're selling solar at 2.5 cents. But how do they get that price? On what basis? The tariff formula, the tax subsidies, the risk allocation. That basic information is utterly lacking in the marketplace today. I'll say one more thing, and I want to make sure to hand it over to Joshua because I think we need the local context more than anything. And that's the reality that we've seen this story before. We know what happens when you don't have information in the marketplace. We've seen this in the mining space, in the oil and gas space. In fact, we've issued a call to action joined by EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, by Transparency International, by OGP, all the folks who had to learn the hard lessons of what happens when contracts of public significance hide behind a facade of private confidentiality. The lack of information is not just a risk, it is not just a lack of efficiency, it is a very real systemic problem. And information sharing has, it's sort of, it's a hard promise to make, but it's a win-win for everyone in the sense that the public gains from increased trust, increased confidence, the private sector gains from reduced transaction costs, governments gain from a reduction in resource costs for overhead and sort of that TA, the technical assistance or the capacity building that's necessary for these contracts. And I'll say one very simple thing at the end of the day, we have now reached the point where power sector investments are larger on a net FDI basis than oil and gas, than mining, than telecoms. It is the largest source of capital inflow into markets today around the world, not just in the Asia Pacific region. And yet we have such little insight into the structure of those transactions. So I think on the point of insight and concerns around that, I'll hand it over to my colleague.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. I'm Joshua. I'm from Reboot Philippines. It's an organization based in the Philippines pushing for just energy transition. So I want to provide you with with the local context for the Philippine case. And as Mohammed briefed you earlier, this work that has been done in many other countries. Contract transparency has been proven to help make contracts more transparent and possibly push for least cost contracts. In the Philippines, I'd like to share with you some of our initial findings. So as you can see here, this is the historical timeline of the policy and institutional framework in the Philippines. And before, in the 1980s and the 1990s, the Philippines had a state-owned corporation, the National Power Corporation, which took charge of providing electricity for the whole country. And during the time, the power crisis of the 1980s to the 1990s, and the National Power Corporation wasn't able to meet energy demand. There were concerns, allegations of onerous supply contracts, overconfidence in the Philippines' energy demand growth. And then when the Asian financial crisis came, the Philippines was buried in debt, equal to $18.7 billion US in 2008, or in Philippine pesos, it's 1.3 trillion. So that's a context for the policy change that happened in 2001 that brought about the Electric Power Industry Reform Act. It liberalized the Philippine power sector, it unbundled the power sector, and it pushed for transparency and competition. However, there were many challenges to translating the reforms from EPIRA to more transparency and competition, one of which would be challenges in the procurement. So some reforms are instituted, especially in 2015 when the mandatory CSP process was implemented where all distribution utilities are required to undergo the competitive selection process. So this policy was actually challenged by a case filed by civil society through the Alianza versus ERC case, where a group of civil society actors challenged its postponement. And there were reforms after that. So that's the context. So as we observed, no, even though there's policy in place for transparency, these transparency policies would only work if you have an ecosystem or if you have an environment that will be conducive to leveraging transparency towards more competition. So some prevalent issues in the Philippines, for example, would be market concentration. There are a few companies that own or manage the majority of the power sector in the Philippines, so there's less competition involved. There are perceptions of anti-competitive behavior. There's fragmented information sources. It's very hard to gather data, even though the data is already published technically. And there's very limited public oversight, especially considering that the procurement happens at the level of the distribution utility, and we have 150 plus distribution utilities in the Philippines. Some interventions that have been done in the past years include standardizing contracts, improving disclosure of PSA terms, standardizing definitions of terms, and then pushing for captive consumer participation in bid evaluation, streamlining online submission portals. And even though it's not directly related to transparency, the current push for renewable energy development in the Philippines shows some opportunity in improving competition in the Philippines. So just to maintain the momentum, as we can see in the Philippine case, transparency levels a playing field by addressing information asymmetries across stakeholders, building trust, and this both encourages investments and also improves governance of the sector. But these transparency efforts should happen in parallel with efforts for stakeholders to better leverage the data to participate in the energy space. So some recommendations that we think would be relevant in the Philippines would be setting transparency standards similar to what EITI does for the extractive sector, improving access to energy sector data, and then most especially strengthening the capacity of energy stakeholders, especially in a very decentralized system, such as in the Philippines. So that's all from our end. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, thank you very much. Very good presentation from both of you. Oh, yeah, go ahead. I think it follows on the discussions that I really liked how it followed on from your discussion, and it goes on to their discussion on the importance of contracting, the importance of structures, and for many years when we were starting to do clean energy, that was the biggest barrier. The institutional contract, the policies were there, weren't there, but you tried to get through it by doing a policy through contracts. Right now, we're in a better space, but there still needs to be some more evolution in that space. So I think we'll continue to have that conversation as we go. All right, we'll have the next speaker. Please come up. It's Ms. Isma Mansour. Please, thank you.
Good morning. Assalamualaikum and a very good morning, everyone. So thank you, Sam. My name is Isma. I'm from International Hydropower Association. I think probably not every one of you know what IHA is. We are a membership association where we represent 100 of our members over 120 countries. So well, over the past 2 days, I think you have heard that Asia is transitioning into renewable energy, particularly on solar and wind. But we also must acknowledge that sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. So that's where energy storage is important. So today I will discuss more on the importance of having the right policy to support the pump storage hydropower in supporting this transition. And then the policy toolkit will also address one of the key challenges that Fiona was sharing just now, which is to have regulatory certainty. All right, I'm gonna skip this. Okay, so basically in 2023, the world leaders had made a commitment in COP28 to triple up the world's renewable energy generation capacity from 3.4 terawatt in 2022 to 11.2 terawatt by 2030. So these require significant increase in VRE, like I mentioned just now, especially in the wind and solar space. So to support this scale of growth, pump storage is the only mature long duration storage technology that can provide the flexibility and resilience in the energy system. From this chart, we can see that pump storage deployment is rapidly growing. We are expecting to have a similar the level of conventional hydro by 2030. And beyond that, we are expecting a further acceleration to perhaps twice the deployment of conventional hydro. So more than 80% of this pump storage growth in the next decade will be in China. But we also see some plans increasingly in countries and regions like India and Europe, also Australia and Southeast Asia countries. So despite its attractive long duration capability, we also acknowledge that it is a bit challenging to get pump storage developed effectively. We know that it is a long development with long construction times. Typically, it can take 7 to 8 years with high capex, long payback periods, and each of these projects are very unique. They are very highly site-specific as well. So these issues involving pump storage hydro may result in a harder sales for the policymakers. We need to create a balanced situation where the projects is going to be a private sector developed, where of course the private sector will have the fund, and it has to also be public sector enable, the one who control the policy. So this balanced situation that I mentioned just now is important to help to address these barriers in the pump storage development. So one of the work that IHA has been doing, we have developed these policy toolkits with details on appropriate mechanisms needed to drive the growth of pump storage hydropower development. So this toolkit that we have developed, we have two versions. One is a PDF version. You can download it from our website. But we also have an interactive version where we update any latest development. So it's kind of like interactive in our website. So it will update more on the existing policies and also targets that countries have in terms of pump storage. So the core of this toolkit is talking about these 6 policy recommendations where what the governments can take to support pump storage hydropower. So I'm not going to dwell so much on the details, but most importantly, I want to touch on the first 2. This is based on the proper planning that we have. So the first one is actually we need to assess how much long duration storage and system flexibility is needed in the long term. So when there's proper and reliable assessment, this will increase the developers' confidence in the need of pump storage and the quantity that is required. Then they can put upfront the amount of development money, de-risking these projects and bringing them in on time and on budget. And the second one that I want to highlight is to identify appropriate sites for pump storage plants. Policymakers especially can accelerate this development by filtering and focusing on the potential sites with the best economic, social, and environmental outcomes. So holistic site planning will therefore bring the significant system benefits. So these are what we have in the publications, translating the recommendations to actual policy. Some of the examples, it's available in the toolkit. We have also compiled a catalog of policy that are being implemented globally, which may be adopted by other governments as well. So this is the one that I mentioned just now will be kept live and updated in the website. And we also have list of countries who have pump storage targets, which will also be kept live and updated as and when there's new targets announced. So basically you can see within this region, we have China, we have also Thailand, Indonesia, and Philippines who have like a solid targets on what they want to do in the pump storage space. So that's basically an overview of the policy toolkit that being established by IHA. And we hope that with this toolkit, policymakers will be able to take necessary action to accelerate development of pump storage hydropower. This slide is basically my biggest mandate for today. So we're gonna have this international forum for pump storage hydropower in September in Paris. So this forum, we will bring together world leaders and experts to discuss the critical role of pump storage in the future energy mix. And the registration is now open, so don't miss this opportunity. You can still book now and get the early bird registration rate. We also have several speakers who have confirmed. One of them is Mr. Malcolm Turnbull. He was the former Prime Minister of Australia, and he is also our president of IHA. Yeah, so that will be all from me, and I hope to see some of you in Paris. Thank you.
Thank you, Isma. Just a quick question on this is a very interesting toolkit and very important for policymakers, and you also have toolkits from various other hydro issues, or just pump storage?
For this specifically is for pump storage, but we also have like hydropower guidelines, strategy on how to have like a proper strategy, O&M. That one we work with World Bank. So we basically have like few publications.
And you also do capacity building and training, right?
Yes, correct. So we have our sister company, Hydropower Sustainability Alliance, where they do this training academy on hydropower sustainability standard.
So I'm helping you do your marketing. Okay, thank you very much. The next speaker is Beatrice Yulo, and one of the things that's nice about being the moderator is you can embarrass your friends, because Beatrice and I work together. Many of you who aren't from the Philippines may not know she's a famous rock star here in the Philippines.
I am not.
Usually when I see her on stage, the lights are low, her makeup is stronger, she's going like this with a lot of drums. So if you ever want to see a rock star doing a professional presentation, this is Beatrice. So please go ahead.
It's a pleasure to do the panel with all of you and with you, Sam. So I'm Beatrice Gomez, and I work in the ADB's Office of Safeguards. I'm going to focus on whether protecting biodiversity is really at odds with renewable energy expansion. So let's unpack this dense issue and explore how we can move forward without making unnecessary trade-offs. So as most of you know, almost 3/4 of emissions that contribute to the rise in average global temperatures is attributed to energy production. The demand for energy will continue to rise because of increased population and economic growth. And particularly, this is going to happen in Asia and the Pacific, where some of the world's most climate change vulnerable countries are located. The increased development of clean energy sources may have unintended impacts on human and natural systems. Poorly sited renewable energy projects can have significant impacts on wildlife. In general, solar and wind projects take a lot of area, right, to generate utility scale power generation. So impacts on natural ecosystems and biodiversity are a particular concern. One recent study actually concluded that if renewable energy projects were only sited based on their maximum energy production, millions of hectares of natural habitat would be lost globally, and ranges of many hundreds of threatened species would be impacted. Perversely, the loss of this natural habitat would result in the release of almost 415 million tons of stored carbon. So that's going to undermine the climate change benefits associated with this transition to renewable energy. So why does it matter? Asia and the Pacific hosts 17 of the 36 global biodiversity hotspots, We have 3/4 of the world's coral reefs. We have the highest diversity of marine ecosystems and a large proportion of the remaining rainforests in the world. This exceptional biodiversity underpins a lot of ecosystem services, including regulating our climate, providing food, fresh water, livelihoods to 4.7 billion people, approximately 60% of the world. Do you care enough now? So the idea that we must choose between biodiversity protection and renewable energy expansion is false, because these two goals are not at odds. They can and must be pursued together through strategic planning, innovation, and collaboration. Even if we conduct the screening and determine ecological sensitivity of different projects and insist on best practice interventions to mitigate and offset impacts, the reality is the only way to meet renewable energy targets on a large scale and avoid significant harm to biodiversity is through strategic landscape scale planning. We have enough resources that are geographically widespread. Wind and solar give us the flexibility to avoid ecologically sensitive areas without sacrificing energy potential. The perceived trade-off between biodiversity and renewable energy is usually because biodiversity is ignored at the planning stage. So there are tools that we can use and work with our government partners to align renewable energy goals with conservation priorities. There are also new technologies and approaches that we can use for projects that are sited in higher risk areas. And we can also design projects to deliver co-benefits like restoring degraded land or investing in local conservation programs. Climate and biodiversity are interconnected. Biodiversity loss worsens climate change, and climate change drives species extinction. Addressing one without the other undermines both. So we need to work out how we do nature-safe renewable energy projects that reduce emissions while safeguarding ecosystems. So what do we have in our toolbox? At the planning stage, we can develop strategic environmental and social assessments that can be used at the policy and planning stage to integrate biodiversity considerations in early stage planning. It can help identify ecologically sensitive areas. It can support low conflict siting, overlaying biodiversity and resource maps to guide development towards areas with minimal ecological impact. It can also help us assess cumulative impacts, ensuring that the combined effects of multiple projects are considered and we're not just going piecemeal. Through the stakeholder engagement process that's included in strategic assessments, it ensures local knowledge and biodiversity concerns are factored in national energy strategies. So one of the tools that we can use is a free tool online. It's called AviStep. It's made by BirdLife International, and it was funded by ADB and other MDBs. It overlays avian sensitivity and how it relates to wind, solar infrastructure, and overhead power lines. The information is then laid on top of wind and solar resources, and then it clearly indicates where renewable energy expansion is both technically and ecologically appropriate. This is free and you can go on it today. We can also work with governments to align national energy development strategies with biodiversity conservation goals. So an example of this is setting up biodiversity offset frameworks, so you have a structured way to compensate for unavoidable biodiversity impacts. We can also look at front-loading aggregated offsets. So instead of doing offsets project by project, you would do it by sector or by theme. So example, if you have a pipeline of wind projects in a certain country, you could fund a conservation program targeting migratory bird species, for example, which would deliver ecological benefits, but also make things more efficient, helping developers develop their projects in less time. Now, for projects that are in higher risk areas, we have ways to still safeguard biodiversity. We have monitoring that we can use to basically make sure that our mitigation measures are actually working as intended. But I do want to highlight two of the technologies that we're using now in projects in Vietnam and Uzbekistan. These technologies basically allow for the selective and temporary curtailment of the turbines so that energy loss is minimal while minimizing also the collision risk for birds and bats. So the first one is a smart microphone that identifies bats and the activities and basically turns off the turbines when they're in the area. And the second one is also, we've used it on a few projects in Uzbekistan. It's an AI-driven technology that monitors the area. It detects the birds, what they're doing in real time and shut down the turbines. I would like to just show this very short video, if possible. Yeah. Sam says I have time. Thanks, Sam. Could you put the sound on, please? So this is made by Masdar, our partner in Uzbekistan on this project. First in Asia Pacific, first time deployed. Alvin, are you okay? Alvin is our wonderful tech behind the wall. He's like, don't name check me. Okay. Yeah. So anyway, this is our biodiversity expert. She's basically saying, we've covered this 500 megawatt wind power project. It's in an area that is commonly used by raptors for nesting and breeding. They're showing their high-tech telescopes. This is Identiflight, which is AI-driven and has optical, like super advanced cameras. Basically, we have 74 covering the whole expanse of the wind farm. It uses, well, you can read that one. And then see, it tracks the birds as it flies. It goes into a risk zone. And then it talks to each other. There's a neural network that connects all of the turbines together. It assesses what the bird is, what it's doing. Is it near the turbines? Then it shut down the turbines that are causing the risk to the birds. And then I actually saw it happen, and I thought it was staged. And then when it flies out, the turbines go back again. So the energy loss is minimal, but you've saved the birds that you're trying to save. Thank you, Alvin. So I guess in sum, clean energy is essential to limit the impacts of human-induced climate change, and healthy ecosystems are essential to us, right? So by working together, we have to plan wisely, implement fit-for-purpose solutions, so we can avoid trade-offs that undermine the goals that we're trying to achieve. Thanks.
Just thank you very much, Beatrice. Just a quick question, right? We're talking about policies and regulations. Is this a regulation in many countries? Are countries requiring this type of thing to take place right now?
So it's a mix. So some countries, like there are some countries that basically say if you have a wind or solar project, you don't even have to do an environmental assessment. You just go have at it, even if you locate it anywhere, anywhere sensitive. So ADB comes in and we're like, you have to do it, and that causes a lot of drama. In some countries, they say if you're going to do it in a sensitive area, you have biodiversity offsets that you have to put in place. But in reality, they don't implement it. So people just do it. So then ADB comes in and says you actually have to do it, and then it's very hard. So it's definitely a mix, and us, I guess, IFIs and MDBs are pushing the limits of it, and we're trying to get good practice. I guess because we work in the downstream, so in private sector, we're pushing it project by project. But now that we're all together in this new structure and ADB, we're hoping to then now try and figure out how we can leverage our relationships as ADB with the governments to then front load some of this stuff, so then you can streamline permitting and assessments and plan things correctly. So hopefully that's what we'll do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, and for our last speaker, we have Mr. Stephen Tan from the UN SCAP. Come forward, please.
Thank you very much, Sam. And actually, thank you everyone for your attention. I'm the 7th speaker, the last speaker this morning, and you guys have been very attentive. And that is also the very reason that here at SCAP, we wanted to work on financing energy transition. You see in the screen here, in the background, I have the SCAP hall at our seat in Bangkok. The reason I do that for most of my presentations is because I want to identify that the United Nations SCAP is actually the expression, these are my words, of the Economic and Social Council in New York. So we're not just a UN agency, we are the commission. And for that, consensus building is very important. So when the UN wanted to get into financing the energy transition in Asia, we have to make sure that we're going to have all the member states on board. Oh, sorry, I have to turn this in. There we go. See, a challenge that we had was that how do we encompass 53 member states in one go? So what we did was we focused on 3 big middle-income countries, talking about how difficult it is to get them out of their fossil fuels or dirty fuels. In that graph here on the screen that you'll see, Asia is always touted to be the largest region in the world that has RE investments. But if you look at it and if you decipher what's in the picture, you see that China has about 80%, if I'm not mistaken, of all the investments. And then 10% or 12% goes to all the high income countries like Australia and Singapore and what have you. So only about 8% are left to the majority of countries in the region. And these are big middle income countries like Indonesia. So in 2023, SCAP decided to do a project with the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam to look at their challenges in financing this transition. And these are the main challenges that you see on the screen. And what I liked about my previous panelists is that everyone talked about every aspect of this scoping analysis that we had. Everything from enabling regulatory frameworks, the need for fiscal incentives, aligning policies, and what have you, and de-risking. These are all very important. This is what we saw on the ground, not only in Asia, even we went beyond Asia. We went to Baku, we went to Europe, really looking at what are the challenges for everyone in the world. I'm not going to go to each and every one, but I'm just going to highlight financing challenges because I'm from the financing division. And a big factor of that is the cost of capital, cost of equity, foreign exchange issues. All that was what we were flagging as the major hindrance to energy transition financing at the beginning. But then we realized that this is more the symptom rather than the cause. And that's why we're now going to be talking about the geopolitical landscape, the policy and governance challenges. And that's why I'm here today in a regulatory framework session talking to you about financing the energy transition. In this slide, so we're just putting together the analysis of what we had in the 3 countries and putting it simply, what we see are the challenges specifically for policy coherence. That's conflicting national policies and regulatory uncertainty. I think that was already covered a while ago, that a lot of what's happening on the ground is not expressed by the member states. Complex and multi-layered processes, I think this is my favorite example in a lot of these conferences. And for one major RE project, we saw 374 approvals, just for one. Imagine the man hours that needs to happen to get that project off the ground. And number 3, limited oversight. I would really encourage everyone to read between the lines when I say limited oversight and transparency. For this next one, it's a bit more general, but it's still quite related. Challenges in grid infrastructure is still an issue. Cross-border trade is not happening as it should. Geoeconomic fragmentation, basically imagine a chessboard. The supply chain is being used as chess pieces. And of course, you have economic crises like the COVID-19 pandemic that really shocks the world and really throws everything back a few years. What I want to show you now is, because this project of ours is a huge endeavor that really covers a lot of ground, and regulatory frameworks is only one aspect of it. You see, we have recommendations here all the way from modernizing the grid, working with governments, fossil fuel subsidies, and the like, but really today we're only focusing on this aspect. And this last slide of mine really just talks about what are general, as the UN, we try to build consensus. We have 53 member states, as I said. And we have general recommendations out of our analysis from last year. For Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, there's a recurring theme. We want to strengthen the permitting process. We want to improve policy coherence. What does that mean? Again, read between the lines. We mean these countries have very, very sophisticated legal frameworks. They have very sophisticated ministries. But we need to really work together, and that is the role of the UN and other multilaterals, to really get the different ministries that are involved in RE development and transitioning away from fossil fuels to work with one another. Now in the mid column, I just want to talk about the country level work that we're doing now because of this. Because yes, we did have very overarching analysis in the very left column of the screen, but now we are expressing this in project level work that we have in many countries. I'm not going to specify which countries in particular, but I think the example that I want to emphasize in this mid column is the special RE zone financing. Because to get a special RE zone, and we're working with one particular government on this, you need to work with the national government, you need to work with the local government. They don't agree with one another most of the time. And then you have to work with investors that do not agree with them at all. To get them all on the ground, it's quite difficult. And to really pilot something is something that we're trying to do ASAP. And lastly, I just want to talk about, so what's the end of this? So we're trying to really put together a regional energy transition facilitation. Now you'll see this in COP this year and next year. We're trying to put together a more institutionalized capacity for the United Nations in Asia to talk about financing the energy transition across all countries. What does this mean? It's basically an enlargement of what we have now. We have multiple TAs. We're trying to catalyze private finance. Data frameworks and a lot what was discussed a while ago is still an issue up to the state. So it's going to have a regional data repository and of course regional convening. What do we mean by this? You saw the picture in the very beginning. We need to get member states together. We need to get them to agree on terms. And that sometimes is the most challenging aspect of our line of work. And we have to work together, together with all the people, all my fellow panelists and everyone in the audience that I worked with in the past. This is going to happen. And it needs to happen fast. I don't have that graph with me, but we don't have a lot of time. With that, I think I'll end and I'll give you the 20 extra seconds, Sam.
Thank you. You get a special prize for that. Thank you. I'm going to move. Thank you very much. And let's again thank the whole panel here today. They've been very disciplined with the time. And I think because of that, we have half an hour even for discussion and questions. And I'm really happy to hear that. And just a little background, you might seem that the presentations are all over the place, right? So I was the track chair for the whole track 4. So I was the one that sat down and chose which ones were presentations were going to be made. And this was the last session. And so we had picked 4 speakers, but then, oh, this one's really interesting, let's include it. This one's really interesting, let's include it. So that's why we have such a big panel of 7. But I think that there is a common theme across this, and that, when we talk about clean energy and we talk about trying to get that off the ground, a lot of work needs to be done on the regulatory side, on the contracting side, the incentives that governments put in. Industry associations are also trying to do that to get the frameworks together, all the way through safeguards and making sure that all has to happen. So there's a common thread that a lot of work needs to be done and continues to be done going forward. So I'm going to open up the floor. There's these 2 mics in the middle. If you want to speak, stand behind the mic and go ahead and introduce yourself and ask your question. And then I'm going to take three questions at a time and have that conversation. There are also some questions online. I like it when people are here in person and we can ask the questions in person, so we'll do that, but I'll get to these questions online later on. Please.
I thought it'd be interesting to ask the panel where they think the low-hanging fruit is. If they were to target one issue each that would help kind of clean energy investments within the sector in the region, what would their change be and why aren't we doing it?
Very good question. Hang on to that. Anybody else have any questions that they want to put forward? Okay. No, but maybe this will get things going. But let's go through the panel. We go in order here and what your thoughts are. Each one of your low-hanging fruit going forward, please.
Gosh, this is like keeping to 7 minutes, keeping to 1 point. I think if I was to look at what investors in the private sector primarily would look to, it's going to be having that bankable project document. So I think if I were to pick one thing, I would say it's government presenting project contracts that are properly de-risked in terms of, I'd probably say, government support and probably foreign exchange sort of mitigants.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thanks. I think when we talk about clean energy financing, and I'll focus on financing. It's most of the times utility scale, solar, wind. There is a lot of opportunity in decentralized renewable energy in many countries, many smaller countries, small islands, and there's not enough focus there. So we need policies, and we need the role and the focus of multilateral development banks, the DFIs, to look at creating structured products to enable private sector participation. I think that's one of the biggest gaps that we see when we work across markets. Thank you.
I'll say for the purposes of the transparency conversation, it's actually quite a simple answer. So one of the most common myths that we have to debunk with governments that we work with around transparency is the idea that private contracts are confidential. Confidentiality clauses are binding to the parties to the contract. It's usually the buyer and the seller. It's usually the utility and the IPP. It has nothing to do with the host government, has nothing to do with the regulator. And so in many of the markets where we work, one of the very simple fixes is the regulator requires the parties to give up their confidentiality rights as a condition of a license. You want a license to operate in our market? Show us your cards, show us your contract. And so it's actually incredibly simple to implement once you have a consensus around the value of that information being in the marketplace. The fixes are not that hard.
From my end, at least in the Philippine setting, one of the lowest hanging fruits that we can work on is on data availability. In our case, data should already be published. It is provided in different government agencies' websites, but it's very difficult to piece these together. Like, for example, if you look at the decisions on power supply agreements, these are available in image files. So if you're an independent observer, either from the civil society side or from industry, you would have to go over all of these documents. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort. Of course, it will have implications on the labor costs. So it's very difficult to make projects or push for projects in from any sector because you don't have these basic information that could be easily resolved through technology and even with the policies that we already have right now.
From my angle, I think this is a very tricky question because I don't know whether there's any low-hanging fruits when you talk about regulatory frameworks. But then, to me personally, I think bilateral, discussion can help a lot because, like, if you have like two parties talking about it, you don't have like many ideas or opinions or suggestions, and work for the government to work with established or experienced developers that because they have been there, they've done that, so they could help in terms of giving you the exact things that you need to address to make sure that you can develop the projects effectively. Yeah.
In my case, I think one of the low-hanging fruit will be, utilizing, considering biodiversity in the planning when you're deciding on what areas to exploit for renewable energy projects. In some cases, we already have that data, so it's a matter of plugging it into the government's planning, planning in their planning for the renewable energy sector. PPAs usually have really short time frames, and so the private sector client will bid on it, and then they have to get construction done in 2 years or something, which if it's in an area that's a little bit more sensitive, the baseline studies are going to take 2 years, so if they want financing from people such as ADB, development banks, you're going to have to do that. So if we can front load that by actually just saying, these are kind of areas that will be high risk, and these areas are areas that you can easily put projects on, then that will streamline everything. Everybody will be happy, I think.
2 things from my end. I want to focus on permitting process again, because in the slides a while ago I didn't get to that. There's a virtual one-stop shop that the Philippines uses, and I think this is something many other countries are very interested in, and that's what we're going to try to have them take a look at, see how it works. Second thing, I would like to say that the UN has the Financing for Development Forum, the 4th one, in Sevilla at the end of June. It's once every 10 years, and I suggest you go there. You urge your governments to talk about financing for development. That's it.
Thank you. Very interesting points, all of you. I'm going to go to, while the audience formulates a second. So I think there's an interesting question here that may spark some discussion from the app. And the question is, do you think the public has a right to know the details and beneficial ownership of the projects that we rely on for our daily power supply, right? And I'm going to give that to Mohammed, with the suspicion that I think Mohammed asked the question so he could have a few more minutes to talk about his topic. But no, I think it's an interesting question because somebody else has also said in the discussion that yes, it's indirectly public money and they have the right to know where it's being spent. So this is an interesting question on transparency across the board. So Mohammed, you want to lead off on that? And others in the panel, if you want to also have your thoughts on that, please.
I'll admit it's a bit self-serving, so I like the softball questions. But
But
very
did you
simple.
put that question?
I did put that question there, I'll be honest. But that was last week. I didn't know it was going to actually come up in the conversation. I'll say very quickly just the justification, the logic behind it. I mean, the idea of the public having access to information is wonderful in principle, but as a practical matter, the interesting thing about electricity contracts, electricity markets, is they're the last truly publicly regulated market on earth. You can't sell electricity at whatever price you want. You have to have permission from the government through a permit. You have to have a tariff application to know the price to sell that electricity. And so the reason utilities exist is because we give them the privilege of existing. We give them the privilege of a monopoly. We give them the privilege of having captive customers. You as an electricity customer can't go buy power from anybody else in most cases. You have to buy it from the utility. So when we say the public has a right to access to this information, it's not an abstract idea. They're paying the bills at the end of the day. And sometimes they're not just paying them as ratepayers, they're paying them as taxpayers, because when you do have cases of default, when unfortunately projects do go bad and there's a termination payment, oftentimes in many emerging markets, these contracts are sovereign guaranteed. So the sovereign ends up bearing the cost of that project buyout, and again, that gets passed on to the taxpayers. Let me just add one very small thing though. It's not just about the public, it's about the market. The investors have a right to know what's going on in the marketplace as well. And I think if we're talking about asking investors to take risks, which is what they're doing, to come into markets where they have no familiarity, to put their capital at risk, and to take a chance in a market, we owe them the maximum amount of information and insight possible to make an informed decision. So if we want them to do their job well of risk assessment, risk pricing, and investment, decision making, we should make their jobs as easy as possible. So I think it's a public and others.
Thanks, Mohammed. Anybody on the panel want to have a thought on that too?
Can I add on that?
Please.
Okay, so basically, like in our hydropower projects, I mentioned earlier on the hydropower sustainability standards. So one of the things that is the key to these standards is about communication and consultations. FPIC, free prior informed consultation as well. So especially when we do hydropower projects, it will involve many public affected community and also indigenous people. So they have the rights to know, and we need to be transparent in the projects that we are developing. And one of the things or the process for a project that need to be certified, that you have to demonstrate that you are developing hydropower sustainably. We have this period called public consultation. So even though that we have our independent assessors assessing the projects and then claim that, okay, these projects, they are developed sustainably, but even with that independent assessor, we also have this public consultation. So that's how we wanted to demonstrate that how important it is to make sure that all these projects are made known to the public and be transparent. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
I think there's also another limb to that. Obviously, when you are sitting negotiating with governments, and again, obviously the end user, is the person that has to pay the tariff. But you'll sit and there'll be long discussions as to why didn't I get a really low tariff? And I think one thing people often forget is, if you have gone and bid a project, it's been done by an ADB program or IFC scaling solar, it's completely de-risked, the land has been handed to you. Clearly the cost to the developer operator is going to be significantly lower than it is if they have to go and source their own land, manage all of these complex issues. So I think there's a lot to be said for providing that transparency so that the end consumer as well as governments actually understand why their prices may not seem as competitive as their neighbours, because it's just really unhelpful to the whole sort of process of development to compare apples and peaches.
Very good point. Very good point. I'm going to stop on this transparency because we have a question on the floor, please.
Thank you very much. Question for Ms. Bea. We all know that renewable energy is the key to this climate crisis, and that towards this transition to renewable energy systems, we must not repeat the sins of the fossil fuel industry. And so we must not step on human rights, indigenous people's rights, gender rights, biodiversity. And it was very interesting to see the Avi step is already moving. Unfortunately, I don't see the Philippines on the map yet. So when will you expand the services to, let's say, the Philippines, or what would it take to expand the services here? Will it take another grant from ADB or something? But when can we get it for the Philippines? Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, it's actually on the way. So the contract's already signed. They're already working on it. Duncan Lang, who's with the Environment Thematic Group, is heading that. So we did the initial shortlist of countries. ADB funded that, and then some other MDBs funded other countries, and then now we have Philippines on the list. So that's coming soon.
Thank you. Your answer was so short. I was still going through the answer. Anybody else have? Thought you'd give more. Anybody else have any questions from the floor to the panel? If not, I'm going to go to this topic again, to the issue behind the issue, on the incentives that are put in place by the central banks and so on to get the financial system going in that direction. And the question on the board is an interesting one. The ASEAN SDG bond toolkits and green bonds has been developed in collaboration with the International Capital Markets Association based on ICMA's green bond principles. I don't know anything about any of that, but what is your view on ASEAN green bond standards? What is the M&E process during project period? Please.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I think I believe that this has provided uniformity and kind of consistency when you look at it from a financier's lens. I mean, when the issuer is putting out a product, it is very important to follow a common standard. And the ASEAN capital markets has done a great job in putting that green bond model there. It is anyway based on the ICMA's framework. Particularly, I think it provides a kind of interoperability. From a M&E perspective, I think it's very clear in terms of the need for assessing the use of proceeds as per the guidance that is given, the process for project evaluation or selection, the management of proceeds, all this the issuer needs to put down. The reporting needs to be there, and this needs to also be assessed by a third party, getting in a credible reviewer to look at it. I think all of this is making the issuance very transparent for quality investors to come in. I think that's a very important point to look at. And in a market today where issuers are looking for green premium, right? And there's this whole discussion about the cost of due diligence, the cost of reporting. Standards like this actually help in bringing that down. So I think that's an important point to note. And also encourage the market to create a very robust kind of a green asset base for more and more issuers to come in. So I think it's good. We need more regional cooperation beyond green bond frameworks in other matters like this, where finance can fly very seamless across markets.
Just to add quickly on the issue of sort of innovative financing models and legal structures as well, I say this in a positive way, and just to sort of give some credit to my colleagues at the table here, we have only just begun to see true innovation in the finance and the legal space when it comes to power projects. I think the last 10, 15 years, the last two generations, we've seen incredible strides and increases in efficiency in solar panels and wind turbine maximization, et cetera. But, and I say this, for example, my colleague Fiona here to the right, and the Trinity team, they've come up with some of the coolest, and I'm going to use that word because I'm a legal nerd, some of the coolest solutions to insurance balancing for natural gas projects in Africa and data sharing in East Africa, and coming up with clever ways to deal with really sticky problems in contracts. On green financing, we think about the financing of a project and getting to financial close as the ultimate day. We've finished the project. The truth is, these projects live huge and other complex lives the day that they're built, the day that they're operated. The secondary market around power projects, the ability to resale, refinance, and to bundle these projects is what actually creates the efficiencies and it sort of recycles the capital that pushes all the money back into the market to build the next generation of projects. So we can't just think about building it as the end of it. They have to live other lives and have other capacities. So if we really want to drive this massive scale of renewable energy deployment to achieve some of these climate goals, we're thinking a little bit small today. We have to think about an economy in a marketplace which is not just building projects, it's selling projects, it's refinancing projects, it's bundling projects. It's essentially an entire platform of asset transfers over the course of the 25 years plus. It's not just that COD moment, that construction that matters if we really want to have maximum speed and growth in the marketplace. So I think the next rock stars, to use your term, are the lawyers and the bankers who are really going to drive scale in this marketplace.
And then speaking of scale, I'm going to come back to Namita. Namita, do you know whether the central banks are talking to each other and coordinating with each other? Because you gave some very good examples of some that are doing an innovative thing. But if we can get the central banks to talk to each other, and central banks are not the most innovative everywhere. They're not supposed to be innovative. They're supposed to be conservative and things like that. So are they?
Yeah, they are. In fact, the Financial Stability Board that was put out by the Bank of England after the 2008 crisis, that brought central banks together, and there are almost about 80 banks, 80 central banks across the world who are members of the Financial Stability Board, and they have also pivoted towards climate-related, green-related aspects because it is very important to policy making. And what is now happening and what we're seeing in the market is certain proponents like the Bank of England or the ECB, they are the leaders and they're trying out some of these frameworks, they're trying out some of these policies, and then they're working back with other central banks who are keen to put certain processes in place. So I think that uniformity is coming about. Of course, every country has its own economic challenges, monetary challenges to deal with, and therefore they would need to be on that at a different life cycle. However, there's at least a common form that's coming together. Just one last point, the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision has also brought out certain guidances for the supervisors and the reporting entities to look at climate-related or green-related financing. So I think that's a good thing.
That's something to look forward to going forward. Thank you. Anything else from the floor? Please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Rafi from WWF Indonesia. Questions to Bia. Just wondering, because you were working mostly with the private sector, right? And just share a little context that we in WWF Indonesia assisted PLN, the utility provider in Indonesia, for the biodiversity management plan guideline and how they have proper robust safeguard on biodiversity. Since beforehand they tend to use what the lender said, and they doesn't have any in-house guideline on how they could manage biodiversity. And we also assisted they become the first Indonesian company for adopting the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. I just wondering, what do you see any, because PLN as a state-owned companies have little nuance rather than the private sector. So if you know, is there any some kind of lessons that you working with mostly private sectors across the Asia and Pacific, what that could be, I think, the key points that maybe that's differences between the SOEs and the private sectors on this regard, on how we can ensure the robust safeguard could be implemented by the utility provider since the very first beginning. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Oh,
Right.
sorry,
I'm
do you
gonna
want to
take
take
another question there? Beatrice, hang on.
Good morning. I'm Lion Villacorta from USAID Philippines. Just out of curiosity, do you have similar work on this regulatory and policy framework studies on transmission? And the reason I ask this is that as we look at headline macros, the price for ARIA has plummeted. And so soon enough, it will be 20 or 30% of what retail payers are paying and 60% are transmission. And so are you looking into this? And in terms of ESG, is there enough sort of strategy in terms of, by the way, sorry, we work on sort of renewable energy zones with the US National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And I like the idea of overlaying more biodiversity considerations into it. But what I see is it's front loading a lot of planning capacity that seems to be, for me, from first world or even from alien economies. It's seemingly paralyzing. It's not a secret that the Philippines has having issues with its system operator.
Right.
And so I was wondering if we implement all of these sort of considerations into generation and others, are we sort of neglecting the fact that the bigger
Transmission,
share would be transmission in the future cost? Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see USAID at the meeting. You Breachers, go ahead and answer the first question, and others can go for the second question, because I think that's a broader issue on regulation, please.
Okay. So I work particularly in private sector end. So there's a lot of lessons we learn project by project that actually can be solved by working with the SOEs, for example, in then streamlining things or making it easier for private developers to do the work, but also within the requirements that we, put forward in our policy. So, for example, we know, like, we are actually now working with an SOE in Kazakhstan who's in charge of transmission lines. They've signed an MOU with us to actually look at their way of working, how they manage environmental and social risks, in comparison with our new environment and social framework that's coming into play next year. So they've agreed to do that. And if we can get the needle moved on certain things like biodiversity, for example, but also on just general social management, how resettlement is done, or indigenous peoples are involved in development. If we can get that moving a little bit, that will make it easier for private sector to work in the country. So we do learn lessons. Now, the puzzle is, how do we connect it now upstream? And we're still working on that, but it's hard, but we'll try.
Thank you. Does anybody have a thought on the transmission question, transmission regulatory policy? Or you were going to say something?
I was going to go to the question on ESG and how are you front loading all of that for institutions to look at. I think that's from a practitioner's perspective, that's absolutely relevant. When I have been a banker, and when I was lending in 2010 and IFC asked us to apply ESG, we said nobody has heard about it, nobody does it. So we don't have the level playing field. So it's all about, and I'm again coming from the financier's lens, it's all about creating that level playing field and making it a business case. Because regulations can only take you thus far, and it shouldn't be a tick box exercise. So what we are seeing in many markets is that there are regulations which are starting with disclosures. I think that's like the kind of the low hanging fruit. Then measurement report, then take your targets, and then move towards assessment of portfolios, and then make the implementation plan. So that's the kind of path or trajectory that many financial institutions are taking. Many governments, regulators are also asking for financial institutions to look at that. And this is also linked to the nationally determined contributions that the countries have taken. Many countries, when they were taking these commitments, I don't know how many consultations with the real economy players really did happen. So suddenly here were the commitments, and now the real economy players have to align to it. But there is an opportunity. So I'm not criticizing that process, but I'm saying that there is an opportunity in how do you look at renewable energy, or how do you look at green financing or climate related aspects, water, and so many others that we don't even talk about today. Green hydrogen, for example. The good part is the governments and the regulators are looking at subsidies. So they're incentivizing, they're looking at the right kind of policies for more and more finance to go to it. And I think that's the good part. But yes, I mean, it's a glide path that organizations would need to take. And it's also about how does it sit as a business case.
Thank you. The light is flashing now. She stepped up. She's looking at me fiercely, so I'm a bit scared. So let's just, there's a lot of, sorry we didn't get your transmission question, actually. But there are a lot of questions, actually, that are very, very good in the app. And I want to encourage the speakers to try to answer them, as if you have a few minutes to answer the questions here in the app and go through it. And others on the floor, because all of you, there's expertise on the floor also. So please answer the app. Okay, since you have a flower on your ear, you can ask one quick question.
Thank you so much. So I'm standing here representing the Pacific. I see a lot of our Asian friends asking questions. We travel 24 hours each on our own to get here, so we're using the opportunity. It is beautiful that there are 7 of you up there, and most of us have attended your session because of the thematic chat session topic. So as you know, when there's an overload in power, the system might shut down, and kind of feels like that about now. So my question is, and request is, if you can all give one tip or top advice, one each, because 7 represents completion and perfection, so that we can take away, and when our governments ask us, we'll just give them exactly what you told us, so that we can sort of like form a checklist as well when we're trying to strengthen our regulatory frameworks as well as our policies.
Okay, that's a good question.
Pacific, do you agree with me?
Yeah, we have a large contingency here all week from the Pacific. Thank you. Please, go ahead.
Okay, again, one. What are you doing to me? Honestly, I'd say the most important thing, I think, is capacity building. So I do think it's, the reality is it's generally DFIs like ADB and the World Bank that are going to be the ones that are able to provide the innovative funds that ultimately are going to help you achieve what you are trying to achieve. So I would say speaking with these institutions to get them to come to your ministries to educate people on actually what is involved in a renewable energy project, what will be asked of you by the private sector, and actually explaining, because sometimes it's not easy when someone's telling you, well, you need to give the private sector this, 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 and this, and you think it's supposed to be a partnership. Why am I having to give all these various incentives? But there is a reason why a lot of the risk allocation is standardized. Obviously, I think for somewhere, your Pacific Islands, your projects will probably be slightly different. You're not going to have one huge, probably, 80 megawatt project, because you've probably got lots of little islands, you've probably got limitations on space. So again, I think DFIs can really help you plan the most effective project and also help with the capacity building within country to set up I guess, templates that will help you attract investment.
Thank you.
Yes, everybody, but 1 minute each.
Yes.
Because we're getting hungry.
Thanks for that question, and I can relate to your hours of travel. I just went to Fiji for a project, and we work with the International Solar Alliance, and we were working on solar financing for Fiji, Samoa, PNG, Tonga. So I think one thing that I would say is concessionality. If you look at the capital requirements of these small islands, central banks and monetary authorities need to provide some kind of concessionality in terms of the capital that is coming in, that will enable private players, because these are very small projects, high risk. So that needs to be taken into consideration. And I must mention, I don't know which island you're from, but we all are also working with the Fiji Reserve Bank of Fiji on putting certain norms there. So happy to connect with you. Thank you.
One very simple and helpful piece of advice is tell your lawyers to stop using Google. I was a junior attorney in government. I say this with total modesty and respect, but when you ask a junior attorney, can you find me an example of a PPA? They go to Google and they search it up, or these days they ask ChatGPT. The truth is those contracts aren't there on Google because they're unfortunately held back by confidentiality. You ask ChatGPT, it hallucinates most of the results. And so in today's reality, until we achieve our goal of increased transparency, ask another government, ask another lawyer, ask another person. There's a secret economy. I have 4,000 PPAs on my hard drive. I'm happy to share one of them if you don't tell anybody where I got it from. There's a secret economy of information that hopefully someday will be public, and there's a lot of guidance out there, but it doesn't happen through, it's not on here. It's in here right now, and that's really where the expertise is at the moment.
Thank you.
So from my end, I think what should be worked on would be both data and capacity building. One cannot go without the other. Just to borrow experience from the extractive sector. So in the EITI in the Philippines, there are already efforts in disclosing data, so much so that they already put, like in bulletin boards in the communities, they already publish the data. But the problem there is the communities don't know how to read the data. They don't know how that could be used for them to be able to plan social and environmental interventions for their communities. So despite the fact that data is already available technically in those communities, because the communities that see those data don't have the capacity to translate those into plans, long-term development plans for their own communities so that they can leverage the natural resources that they have, they're not able to use it. So we should be careful that while we're working on transparency, we have to make sure that the data available, the transparency would actually be leveraged by the stakeholders so that they can participate in planning and in maybe engaging even in energy contracts.
Thank you.
I would say proper assessment. I think you know what you need in your system, and then you can go all over the world to benchmark, to have visits to see what other people have. But at the end of the day, it depends on what your system is required. And then it is also, I think, depends on the capacity that you have. They talk about capacity building and everything. So that's one of the most important things as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Very quickly, I think your governments would benefit from planning their clean energy strategy and making sure that environment and social considerations are put in place at the early stage, so you know which parts you can actually go in and exploit right away, and parts that are harder to do. And if you need the expertise, hopefully that can be contributed by the greater community that's interested in working in the Pacific.
Thank you.
Thank you.
SCAT's priority country for this year, one of them is Fiji and to an extent the Pacific. And I would say, people always say mobilize finance. I'd say mobilize less risk-averse banks, and that's what we're trying to do. So we're going to help you with that.
That's fair.
Thank you. So, and with that, my name is Cecily, representing the government of Samoa, and now speaking for the Pacific. And just one point. I sincerely apologize to my colleague on the third sir in relation to the comment made about the lawyers. Not all lawyers in the Pacific are Google fans, but I apologize if that was the experience, but hopefully one day we'll work together, and I'll show you what a PPA looks like in Samoa. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tessa. And thank you to the panelists again for the contributions and the discussions. Thank you all for staying to the end of the session. So thank you very much. And as we go to lunch, look forward to meeting you in the hallways. Thank you, Ben.